What if one of the strangest books of the 1800s was never meant to be funny at all, but a quiet confession from a world that had already fallen apart? What if Dead Souls, the book that people have been taught to read as comedy for generations, was actually a description of a world after disaster, written by a man who saw something he was not allowed to talk about? In the early 1800s, across the huge interior of the Russian Empire, a strange silence seemed to hang over the land. Villages existed on paper, but not in real life. Large properties stretched for miles with no workers you could see. Roads passed through towns that felt incomplete, emptied out, or left behind. And in the middle of this oddly hollow world, a man named Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov traveled from province to province doing something that should have been ridiculous but was completely legal. He bought the names of dead people, not their bodies, not their graves, just their names. On official papers, these people still existed. They were counted, taxed, and recorded. They were in the eyes of the government alive. And that gap between the paper world and the physical world is the foundation of Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls. Officially, the book is called a satirical masterpiece, a sharp criticism of Russian bureaucracy, corruption, and moral rot. That is how it is taught. That is how it is explained. And that explanation is convenient because it stops us from asking a much more disturbing question. Why does this world feel so empty? As we read Dead Souls carefully, slowly, without the assumptions put on it by literary tradition, we notice something unsettling. The Russia Gogol describes is not busy. It is not crowded. It is not alive in the way a working civilization should be. Instead, it feels like a place after something has already gone wrong, a place where systems remain but people are missing, where paperwork continues but reality no longer matches it. This is not just a story about corruption. It is a story about absence. Gogol's landscapes are quiet. His towns feel stuck in time. His landowners rule over properties that seem too big for the number of souls attached to them. Even the living characters often behave like leftovers, focused on property, focused on status, holding on to titles and records rather than production or growth. It is as if the book takes place not in a growing empire, but in the aftermath of a disaster nobody mentions. And Gogol himself is an unusual guide through this world. He was not a rebel. He was not a political opponent. He was deeply religious, thoughtful, and increasingly troubled as he got older. He destroyed the second part of Dead Souls in a moment of despair, convinced that something about what he was writing was spiritually dangerous. That alone should make us pause. Writers do not burn their greatest work without reason. What if Dead Souls was never meant to be read at surface level? What if Gogol was recording a reality that could not be described directly? A society rebuilding itself after a disaster that had already been quietly removed from official memory. Across alternative history research, the early 1800s is more and more described as a reset period, a time marked by sudden population problems, abandoned buildings, orphaned children, and massive rebuilding projects that appear to come from nowhere. Some call this a hidden history, others connect it to a large flood, a civilizational collapse, or a systematic erasure that reshaped the modern world. In that context, Dead Souls reads very differently. The title itself stops being metaphorical. Dead souls are not just immoral people. They are missing people, people who once existed, who are still counted, but who are no longer physically present. A world where the dead outnumber the living, at least on paper, is not a healthy society. It is a society after an event. And Chichikov's journey begins to look like something else entirely. Not a con artist taking advantage of loopholes, but a man moving through the ruins of a system that no longer lines up with reality. A system where ownership, value, and even human existence have been reduced to entries in record books. In this series, we are going to read Dead Souls again, not as literature, not as satire, but as evidence. We will look at the world Gogol describes, the strange things embedded in his story, and the uncomfortable possibility that he was witnessing a world after disaster in the 1800s, one still haunted by what it had lost. And as we follow these clues, we may discover that the strangest thing about dead souls is not what it says, but how much it assumes has already disappeared. Because the deeper we look, the more it feels as though Gogol was not laughing at his world at all. He was recording its aftermath. To understand why dead souls feel so strangely hollow, we must first step into the world it was supposedly describing. Officially, Nikolai Gogol was writing about Russia in the early decades of the 1800s. A vast farming empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas I, held together by bureaucracy, hierarchy, and an institution that defined nearly every aspect of life: serfdom. According to normal history, Russian society at this time was rigid but populated. Millions of peasants were bound to landowners, counted in regular census records known as revisions. These revisions did not happen yearly. Sometimes a decade or more passed between them. During that gap, people were born, people died, but on paper, nothing changed. A man who died shortly after a census would remain officially alive until the next revision. His name would continue to exist in the records. His soul would still be taxed. This, we are told, is the bureaucratic loophole at the heart of dead souls. Chichikov takes advantage of a flaw in the system. He buys the legal ownership of dead serfs, dead souls, so that he can present himself as a wealthy landowner and get loans. It is clever. It is absurd. It is, according to literary scholars, Gogol's satirical jab at a corrupt and dehumanizing system, and on the surface, that explanation works, but only on the surface, because Gogol does not simply describe a flawed system. He describes a world that feels structurally wrong, a world where the paperwork seems more alive than the people, a world where ownership continues even when life has withdrawn. Let us think about the landscape Gogol gives us. Chichikov travels endlessly, yet what he encounters are not thriving towns or packed villages. Instead, he moves through places that feel thinly populated, strangely quiet, almost temporary. Properties appear oversized compared to their activity. Landowners speak proudly of hundreds of souls, yet we rarely see evidence of labor, production, or human density that such numbers would suggest. This is important. Gogol was careful. He was known for observation, for detail, for grounding his work in the textures of real life. If Russian society were truly filled with people, we would expect that energy to spill onto the page. Instead, we get something closer to stillness. Even the officials Chichikov deals with behave less like managers of a living society and more like caretakers of a dying one. Their main concern is not people, but documents, titles, seals, record books. Existence itself is filtered through paper. A soul is not a breathing human being, it is an entry. That reversal is usually treated as metaphor, but Gogol never frames it as such. He presents it as normal, and that normality is unsettling. By the time Dead Souls was published in 1842, Russia had already experienced enormous disruption. The Napoleonic Wars had swept through Europe. Fires had destroyed cities. Borders had shifted. Populations had moved or vanished. Yet these disruptions are rarely addressed directly in the book. They linger instead as an atmosphere, a sense that something has already happened and everyone is pretending otherwise. Chichikov himself is a product of this world. He has no clear past, no roots, no community. He moves through society like a man without history, putting together an identity out of paperwork and performance. His ambition is not to build or create, but to gain legitimacy retroactively, to appear whole by collecting fragments. This is not the psychology of a con man alone. It is the psychology of a survivor navigating a broken system. Think also about Gogol's narrative tone. If this were merely satire, we would expect sharper edges, clear moral targets, exaggerated ridicule, a sense of superiority over the subject. Instead, Gogol writes with a strange mixture of distance and sadness. His humor is muted, his descriptions linger. There is a weight to the writing that feels too heavy for comedy. Even the landowners Chichikov encounters are not vibrant caricatures so much as distortions. They feel incomplete, frozen in habits, locked into repetitive behaviors that suggest stagnation rather than excess. These are not people at the height of a civilization. They are caretakers of something already in decline, and then there is the matter of scale. Russia, according to official accounts, was one of the most populated empires on Earth. Yet Dead Souls repeatedly conveys vastness without density, space without activity, ownership without presence. It is as though Gogol is describing a territory inherited after a loss, a civilization still using inherited structures without fully understanding or repopulating them. This pattern is not unique to Russia. Across Europe and even in the young United States, the early 1800s is marked by strange contradictions. Cities with monumental architecture but modest populations. Buildings that appear oversized for their documented use. Census records that change inexplicably. Large numbers of missing people accounted for only in paperwork. Orphaned children appearing in waves. Entire districts rebuilt with no clear explanation of who lived there before. These are usually treated as unrelated things. But what if they are not? What if Gogol's Russia was not an exception, but an example? What if Dead Souls is not mocking bureaucracy, but revealing its true function in a world after disaster? To maintain the illusion of continuity when continuity has already been broken. Because in a world where people have vanished, records become sacred. They are proof that something once existed. They allow governments to claim legitimacy, landowners to claim wealth, systems to claim stability, even if the underlying reality no longer supports those claims. And this brings us back to the title. Dead souls are not simply a legal quirk. They are the residue of a population that once filled the land, souls that remain counted because to remove them would be to admit loss on a scale too large to explain. Gogol never tells us what happened. He does not describe a disaster. He does not name a cause. Instead, he writes around an absence so widespread that it no longer needs explanation. Everyone behaves as though this is normal. And perhaps for them it was, because by the time Dead Souls was written, the catastrophe, whatever it was, may have already been absorbed into silence. The records adjusted, the narratives softened, the survivors adapted, leaving behind a world where the dead still outnumber the living on paper. And in the next part, we will begin to look closely at the strange things inside Gogol's text itself, the moments where the cracks widen, where the satire fails, and where the book begins to look like something far more disturbing than fiction. Because once we identify these details, the question is no longer whether Dead Souls is strange. It is why no one ever asked what kind of world would make such a story possible in the first place. Once the background is set aside, once we stop reading Dead Souls as a clever literary exercise and instead treat it as a description of lived reality, the strange things begin to surface almost immediately. They do not announce themselves loudly. They build up quietly, persistently, like cracks spreading through a familiar wall. The first strange thing is the most obvious, yet the most ignored, the landscape itself. Gogol's Russia is vast, but it is not alive. As Chichikov moves from town to town, property to property, the reader expects density, workers in fields, crowded roads, noise, motion, the friction of human life. Instead, what we encounter again and again is emptiness. Roads stretch on without interruption. Villages exist but feel thinly inhabited. Properties boast of hundreds of souls, yet the land surrounding them appears strangely inactive, as if waiting for people who never arrive. This is not a passing detail. Gogol repeats it. He lingers on it. The silence of the countryside becomes a constant backdrop. If this were merely stylistic economy, it would vary. But it does not. The absence is consistent. Which leads to the second strange thing: ownership without presence. Landowners in Dead Souls speak proudly of their holdings, of the number of souls attached to their properties. These numbers are treated as markers of wealth and status, and yet the physical reality of those properties does not reflect such scale. We rarely see labor that matches the figures discussed. There is little sense of production, harvest, or group activity. Property exists more convincingly on paper than in space. This reversal is critical. In a functioning farming society, land gets value from labor. In Gogol's world, land gets value from registration. The third strange thing emerges in the behavior of the officials themselves. Chichikov's scheme should raise alarms. On its face, it is absurd. A man traveling around purchasing dead people. Yet the officials he encounters do not react with shock or suspicion. Instead, they are mildly curious, occasionally amused, but largely indifferent. The transaction fits too neatly into their understanding of reality. Why? Because in their world, souls are already abstractions. A soul is not a person. It is a unit, a taxable object, an entry that can be transferred, reassigned, leveraged. Chichikov is not breaking the system. He is using it exactly as designed. This suggests something deeper than corruption. It suggests normalization. The fourth strange thing lies in Chichikov himself. He is an oddly hollow main character. He has no inner life that the reader can access. His past is vague. His motivations are procedural rather than emotional. He does not dream of love, legacy, or creation. He dreams of paperwork, of titles, of appearing whole. He is not acquiring people. He is assembling legitimacy. This makes sense only in a world where legitimacy has become separated from reality, where one can possess without possessing, own without owning, live without living. The fifth strange thing appears in the tone of the book. Dead Souls is officially a comedy, yet it does not read like one. The humor is dry, almost reluctant. The main mood is not laughter, but unease. Scenes linger too long. Descriptions feel weighted. Even when Gogol satirizes, he does so without relief. There is no release. Readers often describe a feeling they cannot quite put into words, that something is off. This sensation is not accidental. Gogol repeatedly draws attention to decay, to dust, to stagnation, to repetition. Characters are trapped in loops of habit, of speech, of thought. Progress is absent. Time feels suspended. This is not the energy of a society in motion. It is the stillness of something stalled. The sixth strange thing is numerical. Numbers are everywhere in Dead Souls. Souls counted, souls transferred, souls mortgaged, and yet actual people are remarkably scarce. The ratio between numerical presence and physical presence feels reversed. We are told of hundreds, thousands, but shown dozens, if that. In historical terms, this difference matters. Census data, tax records, population estimates, these are the backbone of official history. And yet Gogol depicts a society where these numbers no longer match lived experience. This is precisely what one would expect after a population disruption. The seventh strange thing appears in what Gogol does not describe. There is no mention of growth, no mention of expansion, no sense of future. Children are nearly invisible, families are background noise. The world of Dead Souls feels curiously post-generational, as though it is being maintained rather than continued. Civilizations that are thriving focus on tomorrow. Civilizations that have suffered loss focus on preservation. And finally, the eighth strange thing: Gogol's discomfort. After publishing the first part of Dead Souls, Gogol began work on the second. He imagined it as a redemptive arc, a moral climb, and yet he never completed it. Instead, he destroyed the manuscript, burned it, not out of dissatisfaction with craft, but out of spiritual terror. He believed the work itself was dangerous. This reaction is difficult to reconcile with satire. Writers do not destroy comedies because they fear moral corruption. They destroy confessions. Taken individually, each of these strange things can be explained away: literary style, cultural context, artistic choice, but together they form a pattern that points in one direction. Dead Souls describes a society where systems continue without substance, where records outlive reality, where people have become shadows of entries, and entries have become more important than people. This is not simply bureaucratic absurdity. It is post-event logic. It is the logic of a world after loss. And like all worlds after disaster, it does not announce what it has lost. It assumes it. It builds on top of it. It teaches its children not to ask. The strange things in Dead Souls are not loud because the people inside the story are already used to them. They have adapted. They have normalized the abnormal, which raises a troubling possibility. If Gogol was not inventing these conditions, but observing them, if he was writing from within a reality shaped by disappearance, then Dead Souls is not a satire of bureaucracy. It is a record of what happens when a civilization continues after its population no longer matches its buildings, its records, or its memory. In the next part, we will begin connecting these strange things to events beyond the book itself, to timelines, to demographic shifts, to architectural and historical inconsistencies that appear far beyond Russia. Because once we place Gogol's world alongside the wider 1800s, the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of disaster leaves behind paperwork, but not people? Once the strange things inside Dead Souls are laid out side by side, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. Individually, each detail can be dismissed. Together, they form a structure, and structures, unlike coincidences, demand explanation. The first connection appears when we line up Gogol's fictional landscape with the real historical timeline of the early 1800s. Dead Souls was published in 1842, but the world it describes feels older, suspended somewhere between collapse and reconstruction. This is significant because the decades before its publication were among the most turbulent in Eurasian history. The late 1700s and early 1800s saw wars that displaced millions, massive fires that erased entire city centers, and political reorganizations that redrew borders overnight. Moscow burned in 1812. Vast rural regions were destabilized by conscription, famine, and disease. Yet official history treats these events as isolated shocks, temporary disruptions to an otherwise continuous civilization. Gogol's world does not feel continuous. It feels residual. When we compare this to population records, the tension sharpens. Census data from this period is inconsistent, revised irregularly, and often retroactively corrected. Entire categories of people, serfs, migrants, orphans, appear and disappear between revisions. On paper, the population remains stable. On the ground, Gogol shows us a thinning reality. This gap is not unique to Russia. Across Europe, the early 1800s present similar puzzles. Cities with monumental architecture that seem disproportionate to their documented populations. Rural regions with expansive properties and buildings that appear underused. In some cases, sudden rebuilding campaigns occur without clear explanation of what was destroyed or who lived there before. In the United States, a parallel thing unfolds. Young cities inherit massive civic buildings. Orphan trains relocate hundreds of thousands of children with little explanation of where they came from. Census records change sharply in ways that defy natural demographic trends. Again, official history offers fragmented answers. But when placed beside Gogol's descriptions, these fragments begin to line up. The second connection lies in the role of bureaucracy itself. In Dead Souls, bureaucracy is not merely inefficient, It is foundational. It replaces lived reality. Identity, wealth, and existence are determined not by presence, but by documentation. This is precisely the kind of system that emerges after disruption, when authorities must stabilize control over a population that is no longer fully traceable. Paper becomes truth because memory is unreliable. Record books become reality because witnesses are gone. This pattern appears repeatedly in societies after disaster throughout history. After plagues, after wars, after mass displacement, administrative systems expand not to reflect reality, but to impose continuity. Gogol's Russia behaves like a society that has already crossed that threshold. The third connection emerges when we examine the architecture implicit in Dead Souls. Although Gogol rarely focuses on buildings, what he implies is telling. Properties are large. Administrative centers are established. Buildings exist. Yet activity does not match scale. This mismatch mirrors a broader architectural mystery of the 1800s. The presence of advanced monumental structures in regions with limited recorded labor forces, structures that according to official timelines should have required enormous manpower, logistics, and continuity, yet appear during periods of supposed scarcity. Gogol does not explain where these systems came from. He assumes them, just as official history assumes them. The fourth connection is psychological. Characters in Dead Souls do not behave like participants in a confident civilization. They behave like custodians. They hoard titles. They cling to rank. They focus on recognition. They fear scrutiny. This is the psychology of people maintaining inherited systems, not building new ones. Chichikov thrives precisely because of this psychology. He understands that appearances matter more than substance, that legitimacy is performative, that in a world governed by records, one can assemble a self out of paper. This only works if everyone else is already doing the same. The fifth and most telling connection is temporal. Time in Dead Souls feels distorted. The past is vague. The future is absent. The present is repetitive. Characters seem stuck in loops, replaying habits without progression. This temporal stagnation is characteristic of post-traumatic cultures. When a society experiences loss, it cannot articulate, it often freezes. Gogol's narrative reflects this freeze. Even his attempt to write a redemptive sequel fails. It is as if the story itself resists forward motion, as if Gogol, consciously or not, understood that there was no easy moral climb from the world he was describing. At this point, the metaphor becomes unavoidable. Reading Dead Souls is like examining a map with missing landmarks. The roads are there, the borders are drawn, the labels exist, but the terrain no longer matches. Rivers lead nowhere, cities feel hollow, distances make no sense, and yet the map is treated as authoritative. The deeper we dig, the more Dead Souls begins to look like not a satire of a living society, but a guidebook to a reconstructed one, a world pieced together after a rupture using the fragments that remained. This helps explain why Gogol writes the way he does, why he circles absence instead of naming it, why his humor feels strained, why his characters lack interior life, why the landscape feels haunted. He is not describing collapse. He is describing what comes after collapse, when people no longer remember exactly what was lost, only that something does not line up. And this alignment between Gogol's fictional Russia and the broader 1800s strange things forces a reconsideration of the official narrative. Because if Dead Souls is reflective rather than imaginative, then Gogol was not inventing a broken system. He was recording one. Which brings us to a critical threshold. If the strange things in Dead Souls line up with demographic inconsistencies, architectural mismatches, bureaucratic overgrowth, and psychological stagnation across the 1800s, then the book may be pointing toward something far larger than literary critique. It may be pointing toward a civilizational reset, a moment when populations were reduced, records were preserved, and continuity was reconstructed on paper first and reality second. In the next part, we will cross that threshold fully. We will state the hypothesis directly. We will examine what kind of disaster could produce such a world and why its traces survive not in official histories, but in fiction. Because once the pieces are assembled, the picture they form is no longer abstract. It is unmistakable. All of these threads, literary, historical, psychological, come together on a single unsettling possibility, one that reframes Dead Souls entirely, not as satire, not as allegory, but as something far more dangerous for its time. All these clues point to one almost unbelievable conclusion. Dead Souls is a veiled account of a world after disaster, written by a man who could not describe the disaster directly. In this reading, Dead Souls are not metaphors for moral emptiness. They are placeholders, administrative ghosts, names that remain because removing them would expose a loss too large to explain. Chichikov's scheme only works in a world where the number of living people no longer matches the number of people on record, where absence has been normalized, where the dead quietly outnumber the living, at least on paper. This is not a minor bureaucratic quirk. It is the defining feature of a reset society. Imagine a large population collapse happening not in ancient times but closer to the modern era, late 1700s or very early 1800s. A collapse severe enough to empty towns, reduce rural density, and disrupt generational continuity, yet not so complete as to destroy administrative knowledge. Records survive, titles survive, borders survive, but people do not, at least not in the numbers expected. In such a world, paperwork becomes sacred. Record books are preserved because they provide continuity. Census counts are stretched, revised, delayed because updating them truthfully would reveal the gap. Land ownership continues because land cannot admit it is empty, and the concept of a soul shifts from a living person to an accounting unit, flexible, transferable, abstract. This is precisely the world Gogol describes. Chichikov is not exploiting corruption. He is exploiting reconstruction logic. He understands that legitimacy no longer comes from productivity or population, but from alignment with records. If the system believes you own souls, then you do. Whether those souls breathe is irrelevant. And this explains why no one stops him, because everyone else is already participating in the same fiction. Landowners accept the sale of dead souls because acknowledging the truth that their properties are underpopulated, that their wealth is inflated, that their status rests on absence, would destabilize the entire structure. Officials approve the transactions because their authority depends on continuity, not accuracy. The system cannot afford truth. In this light, Dead Souls reads less like comedy and more like quiet horror. Gogol never describes the disaster itself, because in societies after disaster, the event is often unspeakable. It is folded into silence. Survivors rebuild around it without naming it. Cultural memory is reshaped to emphasize continuity rather than rupture. And when the event cannot be spoken, it leaks. It leaks into tone, into atmosphere, into the way landscapes are described, into the strange hollowness of characters, into obsession with order, rank, and documentation, into the absence of children, into the fixation on the past, and the inability to imagine a future. Gogol's book is saturated with these leaks. Even the structure of Dead Souls reflects this trauma. It is circular, episodic, repetitive. Chichikov goes from place to place, repeating the same interactions with slight variations, as if trapped in a loop. This mirrors how post-traumatic cultures behave, rehearsing routines, clinging to form, avoiding progression. And then there is Gogol himself. As he worked on the continuation of Dead Souls, his mental state deteriorated. He became increasingly religious, increasingly fearful, increasingly convinced that his writing was sinful. Eventually, he destroyed the manuscript of the second part, believing it was spiritually corrupt. This is often framed as madness. But what if it was recognition? What if Gogol realized that he was not merely criticizing society, but exposing something fundamental about its origin, something that could not be redeemed with moral uplift, something that could not be resolved within the narrative? A disaster does not lend itself to neat conclusions. If Dead Souls were truly satire, Part 2 would have been easy. Redemption arcs are common, moral awakenings are conventional, but Gogol could not write it, because the world he was describing did not allow for redemption, not without confronting the missing, and that confrontation was impossible. So he burned the pages. This hypothesis also explains why Dead Souls feels so modern, why it resonates with readers who sense alienation, abstraction, and bureaucratic dominance. Because it describes the birth of the modern administrative world, a world built not on organic growth, but on recovery, a world where systems survive people. Seen this way, Dead Souls becomes a transitional document. It sits at the threshold between an older population-dense civilization and a reconstructed one that would eventually present itself as continuous. It records the moment when reality and record separated, and record won. The metaphor is no longer subtle. The investigation is a puzzle, and this is the piece that locks the rest into place. The empty landscapes, the oversized buildings, the obsession with paperwork, the psychological flatness, the narrative stagnation, the author's breakdown. All of it lines up once we accept that Gogol was not imagining a broken world. He was living in one, and he did what writers often do when truth is forbidden. He hid it in plain sight. In the next part, we will strengthen this hypothesis by examining supporting evidence beyond the book itself, biographical details, parallel patterns in other cultures, and why alternative explanations fail to account for the totality of what we see. Because if this theory holds, then Dead Souls is not just a book we misunderstood. It is a warning we never learned how to read. If the hypothesis is correct, if Dead Souls is a veiled account of a world after disaster, then the next question is inevitable. Where is the proof? What evidence exists beyond interpretation, tone, and pattern recognition? And just as importantly, how do we address the objections that always arise when literature is read as testimony rather than fiction? To answer that, we must widen the frame again, but this time with discipline. The first supporting line of evidence lies in Gogol's personal letters and later writings. As he aged, Gogol did not grow more confident in his role as a satirist. He grew fearful. He wrote obsessively about sin, spiritual danger, and the moral consequences of misrepresenting truth. He came to believe that his work carried a burden he could not control. This is not the path of a man amused by his own cleverness. It is the path of someone who believes he has touched something forbidden. Literary scholars often dismiss this as religious extremism or mental instability, but even if that were true, it does not explain why Dead Souls provoked such a reaction. Satire does not usually inspire existential dread. Exposure does. The second line of evidence is comparative. When Dead Souls is placed alongside other early to mid-1800s works, a shared atmosphere emerges. Writers across Europe describe empty roads, decaying properties, moral exhaustion, and a strange fixation on systems rather than people. These are not coordinated narratives. They arise independently in different languages, in different political contexts. What they share is timing. The third line of evidence is demographic. Historical population data from the late 1700s and early 1800s is notoriously unstable. Census methods change abruptly. Categories shift. Margins of error are enormous. Entire populations, especially rural, transient, or institutionalized groups fade in and out of the record. In some regions, population recovery appears unnaturally fast, as if replacement rather than growth were occurring. Official history explains this through migration, improved record-keeping, or natural rebound, but these explanations do not account for the scale of gap implied by the buildings already in place. A world with large properties, extensive road networks, administrative buildings, and monumental civic architecture requires sustained population density over time. Yet the textual and demographic evidence suggests a thinning followed by a rapid normalization. This is consistent with recovery, not continuity. The fourth line of evidence is architectural silence. Many 1800s buildings appear without detailed construction records. They are assumed to be recent because they exist in recent history, but their origins are vague. Restoration and repurposing are documented more clearly than initial construction. This mirrors the logic of a society inheriting structures rather than building them from scratch. Gogol's Russia behaves as though it has inherited itself. The fifth line of evidence is systemic behavior. In Dead Souls, no one asks where the missing people went. This absence of inquiry is not ignorance, it is adaptation. In societies after disruption, asking certain questions destabilizes the fragile illusion of order. Silence becomes a survival mechanism. This behavior is documented repeatedly after plagues, collapses, and mass displacements throughout history. People move on not because they understand, but because they must. Now consider the counterarguments. The most common objection is that Dead Souls is simply satire, exaggeration for effect, that Gogol heightened emptiness and absurdity to critique moral decay. But this explanation fails to address why the exaggeration is so specific, so consistent, and so structurally aligned with real-world strange things. Satire distorts to reveal. Gogol's distortion conceals as much as it exposes. Another objection is that bureaucratic absurdity alone explains everything, that inefficiency, corruption, and outdated systems naturally produce such conditions. But inefficiency does not produce systematic absence. Corruption inflates wealth. It does not erase people. Outdated systems lag reality. They do not reverse it. A third objection is psychological, that readers project modern anxieties onto older texts, but Dead Souls felt unsettling to readers in Gogol's own time. It was controversial, misunderstood, and incomplete. Its discomfort is not retrospective. Most importantly, none of these counter-arguments explain Gogol's inability to complete the work. If the problem were merely moral satire, resolution was possible. If the problem were character flaws, redemption was available. But if the problem was structural, if the world itself was built on absence, then no narrative solution exists. You cannot redeem a missing population, and that is why Part 2 had to be destroyed. The final reinforcing evidence is the persistence of the pattern. We still live in a world where records often matter more than reality, where economic value is abstracted, where legitimacy is conferred by documentation rather than presence, where people can exist legally without existing physically and vice versa. Dead Souls does not feel old-fashioned because it describes the origin of this logic. It captures the moment when humanity began to live inside systems rather than communities, systems born not from organic growth but from recovery. This does not mean Gogol understood the full scope of what he was witnessing. He did not need to. He only needed to observe accurately. And accuracy in this case was more dangerous than imagination. Taken together, the evidence does not prove a single catastrophic event in the way a date or a document would. Instead, it proves something subtler and perhaps more unsettling, that the 1800s shows all the behavioral, administrative, and psychological markers of a civilization that had already suffered a massive, unacknowledged loss. Dead Souls is not the cause of this realization. It is the artifact that preserved it. And once that artifact is recognized, the question shifts again, not toward proof alone, but toward meaning. If this is true, if Gogol was recording the aftermath of something history refused to name, then what does that say about the world that followed? What does it say about us? That is the question we must face next. If Dead Souls is read not as satire but as survivor testimony, if it is a document written from within the aftermath rather than commentary from above, then its implications extend far beyond Gogol.